Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our weekly lecture series here at the Oxford Martin School. Let me begin by saying that we are live broadcasting this lecture, so both to Professor Dominic Johnson and also to all those who later on might have things to say in terms of discussion and questions. There is a global audience following these lectures, so please also turn off your phones, which I just remembered. And let me also, before I introduce our speaker for this afternoon, just draw your attention to two forthcoming events. On Monday, June 5th at 4 p.m. to 5:30 here at the Oxford Martin School, we will have an event with the Resolution Foundation with Lord Willits and Professors Brian Nolan and John Muhlbauer, an age-old problem exploring Britain's new wealth divides. I think this will probably be one of the more fascinating lectures of the year, since it touches on something where both research here in Oxford but also the work of the Resolution Foundation clearly has added a great deal of insight. So on the 5th of June, that is 4 to 5:30. And then we're also very privileged to have Amory Lovins, physicist, co-founder, chief scientist, and chairman emeritus of the Rocky Mountain Institute, coming to the Oxford Martin School the next day on the 6th of June for a special lecture on disruptive oil and electricity futures, starting at 5 p.m., 6th of June, here at the Oxford Martin School. Let me now turn to our lecturer for this evening. Professor Dominic Johnson is the Alistair Buchan Professor of International Relations in the Department of Politics and International Relations here at the university. He is also, and that's why we are so happy to see him here this afternoon, co-director of the Oxford Martin Programme on Natural Governance and a Fellow of St. Anthony's College. His lecture, The Ecology of War, an Evolutionary Perspective on Conflict over Resources and Prospects for Peace, is one that we found extremely enticing in terms of the theme that we have chosen for this term of our lectures, where we are trying to focus particularly on the connection between nature, conflict, and particularly the interface between human beings and resources in understanding these connections better. So, Dominic, with these introductory remarks, I hand you an audience and take us on a journey. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hakim, and thank you all of you for coming on this beautiful afternoon. I did some research, and the King's Arms is definitely hotter, so this is the place to be. So let me start with a puzzle. Many of my colleagues see war as a puzzle. If states were rational actors, they should be able to agree on a pre-war bargain that reflects their relative power. But this obviously doesn't happen because wars occur, and at great cost. And this photo is just the artillery shells spent on a World War I battlefield. So many scholars in my discipline see war as somehow unnatural. It's essentially an aberration. Rational choice theory, which captures the argument I just said about making pre-war bargains, sees war as a result of obstacles to reaching that bargain. Other IR theories make slightly different arguments, but essentially stress the costs of war and find it hard to explain. So essentially, war happens when something goes wrong. And today I just want to explore the reverse possibility that war is actually very natural. These are questions we can ask, evolutionary origins of intergroup conflict? And beyond that, are there evolutionary precedents for intergroup lethal aggression? Is there an adaptive logic to it? When and why does it vary? And do we actually have adaptations for it? So here's an outline of the talk today. A little bit of the perspective on conflict over resources and territory from international relations, and then a perspective from evolution. Then I'll look at some of the differences and similarities between them. I'll introduce a very important concept we call mismatch, and then I'll argue that ecology is useful because it provides a kind of unifying theory for understanding some of these dynamics. And then we'll look a little bit at some implications. So first of all, war from the perspective of international relations. Now, I should start out saying that international relations is actually a very young field. We've been going about 99 years, got an anniversary coming up, and it has very little consensus on big questions. So very basic assumptions and motivations about states and individuals are contested. The same big events in world politics are interpreted extremely differently, and there are radically different theories of motivations of behavior, from realism's focus on power and security to liberalism's focus on institutions and interdependence, and constructivism's focus on the role of ideas. All of these IR theories are very hotly debated, and there are no laws in our discipline. There is, however, one broad point of consensus, and that is the so-called problem of anarchy. Now, if you imagine the situation within states, it's relatively easy, or at least possible, to achieve cooperation, because there is a government and laws acting above citizens and groups, which can encourage, compel, and enforce cooperative agreements or violations of them. So collective action problems are there, but they are somewhat easier to resolve and can be solved domestically. At the international level, this is very different. There is no government above states to compel or enforce behavior. There is no overarching authority or leviathan, as Hobbes called it, and thus nothing to prevent war. And this is the so-called anarchy of international relations. So collective action problems are harder, and they cannot always be resolved at the international level. Now, at this point, people say, well, there is the UN and many other international institutions, and that's fine. But they are somewhat limited. They're not sovereign. So at the end of the day, when the stakes are high, and again, we're thinking of the long course of history here, states are ultimately left to fend for themselves, and cooperation is extremely hard. There is no final arbiter of conflict, so war is always possible as a means of achieving state ends. A kind of dismal view. And this is actually one reason why international relations is a different field to political science. A few years ago, my department had a discussion about whether we should become two different departments, international relations and political science. We decided to cooperate, and we're still together. So that's the sort of broad context, very briefly. What is it that states fight over? Now, as I noted, there are no laws in international relations, but there is one very striking regularity. What jumps out at you from this picture of the world? Dawn?
Its orientation. So
Yes.
that's the problem from the perspective of the European.
Okay.
It's a specific map projection.
Yes.
There's a lot of water.
Yes. These are all true. The thing that strikes me about it, and this is thanks to my training originally with David MacDonald as a biologist here in Oxford, is the lines on the map, the territories. There is one law of international relations, and that is every inch of the globe is divided up into fiercely contested territorial spaces. Now, this is interesting. Even in peacetime, that is extremely evident when we look at a map. But in wartime, it becomes even more important. And when you look at the literature on the causes of war, there's something special about territory. Territorial disputes, as opposed to other kinds of disputes, are actually the most common cause of war. One data set going from 1648, which is the origin of the modern state system, until the end of the Cold War, found that territorial disputes underlay 79% of all wars. There's another data set which is much more intensely studied in international relations called the correlates of war data set. And depending on how you categorize different types of conflict, somewhere around a quarter to a half of wars in that data set are also due to territorial issues. And there's one other data set which sort of confirms this, about a quarter to 50% of militarized interstate disputes, which are confrontation short of war, tend to be about territory. Beyond that, the sheer frequency of territorial conflicts, territorial disputes are actually more likely to lead to recurrent conflicts over time. And when they occur, they are more likely to result in higher fatalities. They're more costly than other kinds of wars. Areas regarded as homeland, in particular, become violently contested. So territorial conflict seems to be a special problem that is often hard to resolve. We don't have to think too hard to think of some very important examples which are not only significant but are very long running and have not been possible to resolve, such as in Israel and the Palestinian territories, and in Kashmir as well. And then also more recently, in the Ukraine. Many people had argued that the era of territorial conquest and annexation was over, and Putin has changed that. Now, I should say at this point, I've painted a gloomy picture. That's what my field is good at doing. But territory is also really important in cooperation. So when territorial disputes are resolved, then democratization and demilitarization tend to follow, statistically speaking. The other thing I find fascinating is Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom's work on indigenous cooperation over common pool resources found that if you don't have a clearly demarcated territory, you will not succeed in solving the collective action problem. And that was first on her list of important design features for collective action. She also noticed that collective action problems arise particularly when resources are dispersed over space or time and therefore somehow have to be shared. If they are uniformly distributed in the environment, we can take a slice of the pie each and own it privately, and we don't need to fight. So that's a little bit of the literature on international relations and war, and in particular, territorial conflict. What about evolution? Well, interestingly, in international relations, political theory more generally, and other social sciences, the conceptions of human nature are actually quite important, but they stem from philosophers. And two of the big ones in my field would be Thomas Hobbes and Rousseau, who had very different conceptions of human nature. So Hobbes was the one who said that in the state of nature, humans are warlike, and war is the consequence of self-preservation. Rousseau had a completely different view. He said, no, in the state of nature, humans are peaceful, and war is actually the consequence of modern social institutions. We've created war by the societies that we've created. Now, an evolutionary biologist can't help but start thinking, well, what do we know about what the state of nature was really like? So while IR theories are founded on philosophical propositions and pay very much attention to the differences between them, we can ask what the empirical evidence says. Now, at this point, let me jump to the punchline, which is actually some data compiled by Max Rosa here at the Oxford Martin School. Is Max here? So what this shows are death rates in war. So the percentage of the population of different societies which are killed as a result of war. Now, the striking thing about this graph is that this is the US and Europe in the 20th century, the so-called bloody 20th century. It's less than 1%. And if you look at non-state societies, so these are smaller scale indigenous societies around the world which have been studied by anthropologists, all of them are much higher than that, some of them significantly so. The top graph shows you the same data from archaeological sites. So it can go up to about 60%. Sam Bowles calculated the average among all of these data, which we have, to be around 13 to 15%. So certainly it is extremely significant and much more significant than we experience today. But let me back up a little bit and rethink this evolutionary perspective. So competition is everywhere in nature, and it's very important for natural selection. Natural selection is a very simple process. If you have fast rabbits and slow rabbits, represented by orange and white dots, you have a very powerful selection process in terms of life and death and reproduction, which selects fast rabbits or fast foxes, and then you have genetic replication, which spreads the successful traits at the expense of the less successful ones. Now, that's a very simple process, but it's very powerful as well. And if you think about it, that very simple three-step process has given rise to all life on Earth, around 100 million species, billions of different adaptations within any of those one species. So competition has driven all life on Earth. So how might this evolutionary perspective help us think about conflict over territory and resources? Well, in general, evolution is useful because it provides us with a broader conceptual and empirical framework. And the core point for me is that there are fundamental behavioral, ecological, organizational, and actually mathematical patterns that underlie the processes of competition and conflict. And these can apply across all sorts of very different types of taxa. And as well, they can be used in specific application to humans. And let me give you one specific example. Now, this is the famous hawk-dove game, originating from the work of John Maynard Smith. And actually, this was the model he used to first introduce the evolutionary game theory into the field. And he conceived of a very simple game to try and understand territorial behavior among animals. So if you're the owner of a territory, you can decide to play hawk or dove. And if you play hawk, you decide to fight. If you play dove, you withdraw. So then he modeled these alternative strategies using this very simple payoff, which is just if I play hawk and you're dove, you withdraw, I get V, which is the value of the resource at stake. You as the dove get 0. If we're both hawks, then we fight. So we incur the cost of conflict, which is C. We remove that from the value of the prize at stake, and then we halve it. And if we both play dove and we both withdraw, you split the difference. It's very simple. But what was interesting is that when you pit these different strategies against each other, you can observe what happens as a result, which strategy turns out to be advantageous, and in the language of evolutionary biology, which turns out to be the evolutionary stable strategy, which is the best strategy in competition with alternative strategies. And what we did recently in a paper with Monica Toft, until recently at the Blavatnik School, is we just laid out these predictions and had to think about how these might apply more broadly. And I won't go through all of the details, but there are various conditions, okay, which change the game. So the most obvious condition is whether the value of the contested resource is greater or less than the cost of conflict. So here, the value is much greater than the cost of conflict. Here it's significantly greater, and here the cost is greater than the prize you're fighting for. So this is kind of the situation that I alluded to at the beginning, when the costs of war seem prohibitive. Now, there are various other conditions among the different possible outcomes. But what's striking is that territorial aggression, which is playing hawk, turns out to be an adaptive strategy under certain well-defined conditions. And in particular, if the value of the resource at stake is significantly higher than the cost of conflict, then the prediction is actually that you should fight to the death over it. And that might sound crazy, but of course we know many species which do exactly that. One example might be lions, for example. If they give up their territory, that will be the end of their chance for reproductive success in their lifetimes. So they might as well fight to the death to maintain it. Now, what is it that's uniquely human? So you may accept at this point that, okay, competition and conflict is pervasive in nature. I accept that. But while animals may fight among themselves in the competition for reproduction, they don't, do they, deliberately seek out and kill members of other groups. That's something humans do. But is lethal intergroup violence uniquely human? Actually, it's not. And one of the best examples is from ants. It's very different from ourselves, of course, but there are many tens of thousands of species of ants, extremely successful in many areas of the world, comprising 25% of the biomass. And many of them are extremely aggressive and fight each other to take over territory and resources. So it's certainly not only humans which carry out lethal intergroup aggression. Closer to us, among mammals, we also know it in certain other species such as wolves, where they will deliberately seek out members of other groups and kill them. Originally controversially, but now no longer controversial, is the same behavior in chimpanzees. So they would have lots of vociferous, noisy battles among groups, which often would not lead to any deaths. But as people studied chimpanzees, they learned that, in fact, much less obvious, they would often deliberately enter into the territories of neighboring groups, find males on their own, and kill them. Now, why do they do this? Well, the Darwinian bottom line is reproduction. And this graph is just to show you that among different species of primates, as an example, if you calculate their metabolic needs of the whole group, then there's a very nice relationship with the amount of territory they need to survive. And you find this kind of relationship among all animals. Now, there's a lot of scatter there, but the general rule is, if you get bigger, there's more of you, you need more space. So, why do chimpanzees kill members of other groups? This is a study from Uganda in Kibale National Park, which tracked over a very long period of time, a decade, all of the movements of the different chimps in the area. And there was one group which systematically killed 18 males over the course of the study in a neighboring group. And then they annexed that territory of that group. And they were able to show that this increase in territory size actually increased female body weight and increased the number of offspring. So there was an adaptive logic to this territorial conflict. Now that's chimpanzees, and at this point you might be thinking, well, we're very different. So this is my second favorite biologist after David, Gary Larson, with the father telling his son that the male sparrow is singing his song to stake out his territory, an instinct common in the lower animals. But in fact, we see some of these same patterns in humans too. So most people in my field are interested in the interaction among humans since about 1648, the origin of the state system. But of course, humans have been around a long time, and the origin of our genus Homo is about 2 million years old. And in that period of time, we spent 99% of it in small-scale societies, in a savanna-like habitat, in one very different from that in which we now live. But what we want to know is what were people like over that very long period of time during which our behavioral and physiological adaptations arose. So there's two main ways into this, and I alluded to them earlier with the data from Max Rosa, that archaeological sites sometimes give us a direct window onto the past. But we also have non-state societies, indigenous small-scale societies, ideally hunter-gatherers or foraging societies like those in which we evolved, which can also provide a window onto our past. Now, early on, it was extremely controversial to suggest that war was common among non-state societies. And you may have heard of Napoleon Chagnon's work. He was vilified in the anthropological community for suggesting that warfare was prevalent among the Yanomamo Indians in Venezuela and Brazil, where he worked. But he was eventually vindicated, and his main findings were that there were actually individual benefits from intergroup violence. Those people who participated in violence and killed had significant reproductive advantages. And that as a group, it was absolutely essential to form alliances and to defend against the predations of other groups. And he wrote this in this book: the Yanomamo among whom I lived were constantly worried about attacks from their neighbors and constantly lived in fear. And this kind of statement jumps out at people like me and Bradley Thayer, who's sitting at the front, because this is exactly the kind of problem which plagues states in the anarchy of the international state system. You cannot ever be sure of your own security, and in anarchy there is no one to protect you. And of course, anarchy in the international system is somewhat of an analogue of the anarchy in our evolutionary past, where there was no one to protect us either. So maybe it's no coincidence that some of the same behaviors have emerged in both hunter-gatherer societies and today in international relations. So after Chagnon's work, a lot of other people have looked at this, and this is one book which is quite well known now, War in Human Civilization by Azar Gat. And here's a couple of things he says about it. Warfare among small-scale societies is remarkably uniform. Despite different regions, environments, and social organizations, there is a perpetual risk of war, rather than its occurrence, right? So it doesn't have to occur to still impact greatly on people's lives. It created a permanent state of insecurity. The human state of nature, he concluded, was indeed, after all, highly insecure and fraught with violent death. A lot of people argue about, well, this is evident from a lot of the findings, but how far back does it really go, especially among hunter-gatherers? And this is a paper which came out last year in Nature, which was the oldest find of a large-scale intergroup killing. And 27 people had died. They were not buried. There's evidence that at least 10 of them were deliberately killed, like this one here, which had a big frontal impact on the skull. And some of them appear to have been bound. Now, this kind of finding is actually quite common, but it's not common to find it as old as 10,000 years ago. So, a recent book by Mark Allen and Terry Jones concluded that it's hard to escape the conclusion from the ethnographic and archaeological evidence from Europe, North America, South America, Australia and New Guinea, that hunter-gatherers, both simple and complex, engaged in socially sanctioned lethal conflicts between independent polities, suggesting an extremely long history of warfare that can ultimately be traced back to the early hominins. So there's a lot of arguments still about this, but this is towards a consensus now. But the question we're really interested in today is why they fight. And this is some data from Lawrence Keeley's book, War Before Civilization, about the causes of conflict among these early societies. Now, there's been a lot of work on the North American, Native American population. So there's data for them alone, and then data for the world, and then some comparison data from state societies in more recent history. Now, all of these reasons sort of pop up as somewhat important, but in particular, the second row down suggests that economic factors, if you like, resources, are particularly important as causes of war in the majority of cases. There's some things which might strike you as remarkable, for example, the motivation to capture women, but it turns out to be extremely common, at least in North America. And then there's the argument that these other kinds of motivations and causes, such as prestige and the collection of trophies, might seem like something completely different, but actually tend to be strategies for promoting success in intergroup conflict with the ultimate goal of securing access to resources. So to me, this is an ecological problem. It's rooted in ecology because it's all about access to resources, not necessarily control of them. It's not necessarily annexing a territory and defending that territory, but it's about having access to those resources. Very important is that there's a lot of variation within that, right? So you don't always do that in all circumstances. You do it when it's profitable to do so. So it's contingent on the environment. And it's not always obvious, as I just alluded to, because there are many ostensible causes and consequences of war. But underneath them, there is typically some kind of economic rationale. So motivations are ultimately geared towards securing control over or access to resources. And for some of you, it might make sense to consider those as primary motivations, where you knowingly conduct intergroup conflicts in the pursuit of security or resources, or the Darwinian bottom line, reproductive success. But there are many secondary motivations, which you see in the literature: status, revenge, trophy hunting, which might seem like something completely different. But it's not that difficult to argue that that ultimately is about securing resources or reducing competition for those resources. Now, one very important thing here is when we start talking about resources and conflicts, people often think of scarcity of resources. But actually, it turns out that while that is a very important cause of conflict, the reverse can be true too. You may have heard of this phrase, the resource curse. This is a modern issue. The resource curse, or the paradox of plenty, is the observation that states today in the world with abundant natural resources tend to have lower economic growth, less democracy, poorer development, and in many cases, more war. And Michael Ross's work, Michael's not here, is he? He was visiting Oxford at some point this year. His research shows that oil in particular is a correlate of increased conflict. So while we often think that conflict might occur when there's a scarcity of resources and we're fighting over scraping the barrel, actually there's good evidence to suggest that there is more conflict with abundant resources. And this study here is a study of 186 indigenous societies around the world, where the more resources there were in the local environment, the more war occurred over time. But this makes sense from a biological point of view, because whatever resources are available, the population will increase to match it, and competition will match it too. There is some research suggesting that it's not due to sheer abundance either, whether that's low abundance or high abundance, but it's more to do with the predictability of resources. And this, again, is a quantitative study from those same 186 societies. We found that small-scale war is also associated with the unpredictability of resources rather than their abundance. So I've talked a little bit about territorial conflict from the perspective of IR and territorial conflict from the perspective of evolution. But it's important to think about the similarities and differences between them because, of course, we are very different. So critical to the causes of war are its benefits and its costs. And we saw that one characterization of part of the literature in IR is that the costs are prohibitive. We shouldn't see war. But of course, the equation includes benefits as well. And this matters because the net costs of war lead us to different conclusions about the causes of war. So if war has net costs, it must be maladaptive. It must be a result of misinformation or mistakes. If war has net benefits, then maybe it's adaptive, and it's a strategy for gaining resources or security. It's important to remember also that sometimes war can be very costly, but it's still strategically advantageous to engage in it because the cost of doing nothing may be greater. Now, in early warfare, the reason I bring all this up is that there's some reasons to believe the cost might actually have been quite minimal and the benefits high. So war, in general, and particularly in early warfare, is often conceived of as a collective action problem. How do you get your mates together to risk life and limb to fight other groups? Why not stay at home and let them do it? Well, in fact, when you look into the kinds of conflict which occur, there are actually two types of warfare in small-scale societies. There are battles, big groups of people confronting each other like this. They are quite rare, and when they occur, they're actually not very lethal. Very few people, sometimes none, die. Much more common are raids, and these are surprise attacks, often carried out at night, where you get a group of people together and you go and pick off an individual from another group. They're very common, and they are usually lethal. Now, this is important. Richard Wrangham proposed the imbalance of power hypothesis, and here he's talking about humans as well as some other social mammals. He observed empirically that the primary mode of killing in social carnivores and chimpanzees and small-scale humans is very similar, that they gang together to ambush and kill rival group members at little cost to themselves, especially among humans using projectiles where possible, right? It's very low risk. So intergroup conflict almost always occurs when attackers have an overwhelming power advantage, and when they don't, they back off. So coalitions become extremely important. But the individual cost of participating in these raids against other groups is actually quite low. Now, Wrangham compared a bunch of different species because one hypothesis is that, well, that may be true, but if you look at different contexts, different aspects of those species' behavior, you might see a very different outcome. So he tabulated some of the kind of key differences among these species which do exhibit lethal intergroup aggression, comparing different mating systems, different forms of coalition formation, and the different kinds of resources that they use, and found that actually, regardless of this variation, all of them seem to carry out the same kind of interspecific aggression. Now, don't worry, David, because this is not saying that the clumpiness of resources does not matter, because when you look within humans, another study he did showed that comparing 42 different foraging societies for which they had good data for, where resources were what they called alienable, that means something you can seize and take away or use to the exclusion of others, conflict tends to be over resources. Where you cannot seize those resources, then conflict does not occur over resources, it tends to occur over other things. So conflict is very much about resources as long as you can actually seize them. So the result of this sort of comparison across different species and then variation within humans suggests, at least to Wrangham, that there are two different hypotheses, both of which are supported. That there is an aspect of intergroup aggression which is instinctive, if you like. It has an instinctive component. It occurs across different ecological contexts. But very importantly, there is a contingency which depends on the environment as well, like here. It depends on the kinds of resources you're faced with. Sometimes it's profitable to fight other groups, and sometimes it isn't. But both of these are strategies ultimately to gain access to resources. Now, mismatch. This is a very important concept. You may have seen a picture like this before. This is a reed warbler feeding a cuckoo chick. A cuckoo has laid its egg in the reed warbler's nest, and it's hatched into a massive cuckoo chick, much bigger than the reed warbler. What's going on? Why doesn't the reed warbler realize it's not its own offspring? Why is it expending its time and energy feeding another species? Well, this doesn't happen very often. So when it happens, the cuckoo chick is able to trick the mechanisms which trigger feeding behavior in the reed warbler. Looks crazy to us, but is actually just the normal functioning of adaptive behavior. Unfortunately, for the wrong purpose. Now, this is a Banksy picture from Los Angeles, actually, but captures the same idea for humans, right? So there's the idea that the reed warbler is mismatched to the environment it's faced with the cuckoo chick in its nest. It's apparently doing something crazy, but it's really just carrying out its adaptive behavior. When we get a McDonald's, we're carrying out our adaptive behavior too, because we like sugar and salt and fat. The problem is that when it's on every corner, then it's extremely unhealthy. And I don't know the statistics for the United Kingdom, but in America, this kills 500,000 Americans every year. So this is one potential solution to the war puzzle, right? That forget about the strategic logic. If we have some instinctive component to territorial conflicts, then that might be triggered whether or not it helps us. And good old Nico Tinbergen, who used to be here in Oxford, and for which the zoology department building is named, taught us to be very careful when we're trying to understand behavior, because you have to consider 4 completely different causes. The ultimate cause, what's its evolutionary function? The proximate cause, what is the specific physiological mechanism giving rise to the behavior? The developmental cause, how does that behavior emerge as you mature into an adult? And the phylogenetic causes, what is the evolutionary baggage we have from our ancestry which leads us to behave in one way rather than another? And this is important because it allows us to distinguish between adaptive and maladaptive behavior. So many behaviors are adaptive in the past and today, so they remain adaptive, but others are maladaptive. And here's the Banksy image represented. Our preference for sugar, salt, and fat was adaptive in the past, but is no longer advantageous today, so that's a maladaptive trait. So it could be that a lot of the territorial aggression we see today, and remember the statistics from modern war, is that territorial aggression is particularly vicious, particularly costly. It could be part of this mismatch explanation. Let me skip that. So I think ecology is quite useful because it offers a kind of unifying theory for thinking about these problems. It doesn't give us the answer, but it at least allows us to ask some different questions and offer some insights. So in our paper, we try to consider whether there are biological roots of human territorial behavior, and we outline 3 things. The adaptive function, which is the adaptive logic of territorial conflicts, and even if it's costly, as we learned from John Maynard Smith's hawk-dove game, even if it's costly, it can be adaptive to fight over territory. There's also insights for behavioral ecology, and I'll talk about this in another slide shortly. This is crucial. The predictions for when territorial behavior is more or less prominent. It's not fixed. And then proximate mechanisms. What is it that we have as humans which lead us into territorial conflict? So this man is very important in international relations. He's called Kenneth Waltz. Many people call him the father of international relations. He wrote one book called Man, the State and War in 1959. He compared the relative importance of individual, state, and international system contributions to understanding international relations. And in that book, he rejected the use of human nature as an explanation of international relations because he thought that human nature was fixed. And he asked, how can a fixed trait, say humans are just aggressive all the time, how can a fixed trait explain variation in war and peace? And this was a great disservice to the discipline because it literally meant for a few decades, Brad, I think there's no exaggeration to say, people have steered away from examining the individual causes of behavior in international relations. But there's no reason to believe this at all because of a story from our friend, the golden-winged sunbird. This is a lovely, famous study on the economics of defending territory. Now, in the lab, they calculated the precise calorific costs of resting, foraging, and defense, and then observed in different plots where there were different levels of resources what the birds did. Now, these birds were territorial, but only sometimes. They were only territorial when it paid off to do so. So defense was quite an effective strategy at medium resource levels. You keep everyone else away and you keep it to yourself. But when there are no resources, why would you defend it? And when there are tons of resources, you don't need to because there's plenty for you and anyone else who's coming in. Now, it's such a simple observation, but it really teaches us that even evolved traits, right, like in this bird, are highly contingent. So if birds can have contingent territorial behavior, of course we can too. Now, I mentioned adaptations. This is something which hasn't been studied very much, but certainly some other people in the recent literature have suggested that the same hawk-dove logic that I explained earlier, the same evolutionary game, turns out to be quite a good model for understanding humans' inclinations and propensity to favor private property. And these guys even called it the property instinct. There are certain psychological biases in the social psychology literature which make perfect sense in the context of territoriality, so-called loss aversion and the endowment effect, where we deviate from rational choice in holding on to the things we already have. We're very unwilling to give them up. Now, that could be a good strategy if we're a territorial species. And in particular, the stubborn defense of homeland. So I argued that there might be a mismatch explanation. We're territorial from the past, but it's no longer adaptive today. Now, that may be true and may be quite important as an explanation in certain settings, but it's also possible that the strategic logic, the adaptive logic of territoriality, remains. So there are many examples in nature of evolutionary matches as well. This is a peregrine which does extremely well on skyscrapers in cities because it evolved to live on cliffs. So sometimes you see perfect matches of evolutionary mechanisms in modern environments. And that may be true among humans as well. And my point here is just very simply that could one argue that Washington's very stubborn attachment to his homeland did not help him win the American War of Independence. He lost more battles than he won. It was extremely costly. But perhaps there was a strategic advantage to that kind of behavior. So I'm on my final couple of slides, really just to think about the implications. There's a lot of discussion about the so-called decline of war. The dashed line is interstate war, war between nations. The solid line is war within nations, which of course has rapidly increased since the end of World War II and the decline of the empires, tailed off a bit now. But many people think that war is going away. They're quite excited about this empirical finding, the so-called democratic peace, which is that while non-democracies fight each other a lot, and as democracies, we also find ourselves fighting non-democracies quite a lot, democracies never fight each other. So perhaps all we need to do is spread democracy and war will go away. But I think considering the lecture series, the kinds of issues we've talked about, there's some reasons to be pretty cautious. So we have a massively increasing population. There'll be an extra billion people just in Africa by 2050. We have severely decreasing resources, important things like oil, food, water, minerals, and space in many cases. So I think territorial conflict is likely to become more important rather than less. I would argue that territorial disputes are also expanding into new domains. We're no longer fighting over physical space, but we're fighting over some new areas like polar regions, but also near-Earth orbits, radio frequencies, the internet, and of course the commercial control of land. And we know that resolving territorial disputes is critical to conflict resolution. I mentioned earlier that we know from quantitative studies that when territorial issues are resolved, demilitarization and democratization follow. I just wonder if we might have a better chance of success if we step back and recognize the broader patterns of territoriality in nature, of which I like to think humans are just one particularly deadly example. And there's some very interesting literature on what happens when two animals both believe, they're tricked in an experiment to believe they both own a particular territory. This is the South and East China Sea, and these dashed lines are the territorial claims of these 6 different nations. China claims all of them, and then several of the other countries claim some or several of the other islands. This is a problem that's not going to go away and is very territorial. This is my last slide now. I talked about mismatch in terms of our behavior not being well aligned with our environment, and our proximate mechanisms are triggered even when it no longer serves the adaptive function. I think there's a bigger problem of ecological mismatch, which is that the groups we belong to are no longer very well aligned with the resources and the environment we need to survive within them. So in the old days, it probably used to be relatively well aligned. But today, particularly if you consider the political borders in Africa, for example, which were set by the empires rather than the people who lived there, there's a huge misalignment of the groups and the territories to which they belong and the resources they need to survive within it. And having painted a very gloomy picture of conflict, this is a hopeful last image of our natural governance program here in the Martin School, where we're trying to look beyond these problems and think about new ways to solve them. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your questions. Would you mind? Sorry, I don't have to think. Thanks.
Dominic, fascinating journey and ending up in a very live theater of analysis and war and study, so to speak, with the Natural Governance Program. We have microphones. One is here. Who would like to kick off? Yes. If you could briefly introduce yourself also.
Thank you. Visiting fellow at the Department of Politics and International Relations.
Great.
I'm very impressed by your presentation. Only one question. You mentioned, or you seem to put a stress on a certain line of thought, stemming from Darwin to Huxley and Spencer. But there is another line of thought belonging to Kropotkin, who used to put a stress on the opposite side, that in nature, on the contrary, we find cooperation and, to a less extent, fight, clash, and killing. So it seems to me that you kind of artificially put a stress on this side, not on the other side.
So thank you very much for the question. I know Kropotkin's writings quite well. Two things to say. One is cooperation is one of the best adaptations to conflict. So I had a whole bunch of slides about the collective action problem, how that is solved, and the idea that war is actually a manifestation of very high in-group cooperation. You can't do it without cooperation. So that's one thing to say. The other thing to say is, well, apart from that aspect, do we know for sure that competition is the sort of driving force of natural selection rather than, say, group selection, which Kropotkin was referring to? And at least in this department, it's not my department now, but my old department of zoology, there's been a kind of vociferous argument against group selection, against the idea that groups are selected and therefore altruism can evolve without somehow serving the self-interest of the genes which are giving rise to that behavior. Now, there is a bit of controversy over this now, the idea of multi-level selection, that you have selection among individuals within the group at the same time as selection between groups, such that altruism could evolve if it favors the group at the expense of other groups and spreads. I think the zoology department is still on the side of self-interest and genes being the bottom line, but there's certainly some interesting discussion of it. And if you email me, I can send you a paper by Anthony Lopez, who's specifically written a critique of Kropotkin and his influence in social science, which has been quite interesting in itself. But thank you very much for the question.
Thank you. Yes, please. And then I have 1, 2, 3. But let's start here at the front. Yeah.
Oliver Scott Curry, Anthropology. Thanks for a great presentation, Dom. I agree with your explanation for why groups go to war. And I wonder if you could just summarize, now we know that, what can we do to stop them going to war?
Okay. Well, I don't have the answers. So I think the democracy thing is very powerful. I'm a little skeptical because it's all concentrated in Western Europe and Western societies, so who knows what will happen. But that would be sort of one answer. Maybe you have a better one that you've got on the top of your mind. Do you mean, like, what are the specific conclusions from this that we might then implement to reduce conflict? Okay. Yeah, so then I would think it's to do with altering perceptions of who owns what chunks of land. So while I kind of gave the argument for the material adaptive logic of territorial conflict, I think often in politics today, the problem is actually the perceptions of ownership, not actual ownership. Actual ownership might never change, but perceptions perhaps can be. And if you change people's perceptions, then you alter the behavioral consequences. So that would be one area I'd be kind of interested to pursue. I don't know if it's
had the second hand there.
Thank you. I'm Francois, African Studies. I am wondering whether the addition of an extra element either adds complexity or confirms your theory, and that is transnational non-state actors. Most of the wars that are fought today are between states and something that is not a state, and that is not necessarily found within the territory of that state. How do you fit that in the story?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one way of thinking of that is thinking about intra-state conflicts, civil wars. And I actually don't think it's very different from international relations, because the structure of government has broken down and you have something approaching anarchy within the state, and therefore all of the same kind of logic applies. Transnational actors, like transnational terrorist groups, but you could also argue transnational institutions, operate at a different level above states. I think there's no reason to believe that the way they interact with each other and interact with states might not follow some of the same logic, but I don't know. I'd have to think about that. What do you think? Yeah. I think we're still...
a lot of PhDs here, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
DPhils.
I mean, yeah, exactly. That's a good thing to say, because a lot of our DPhil students are working on exactly that in our department. Is the concept of the nation state breaking down after 3.5 centuries of pretty good innings? Things seem to be breaking down. So what does the new world look like? And other people say the state is coming back, the return of geopolitics and the rise of China, the rise of the BRICS states. Nations are becoming stronger in some ways. So we shall see.
Thank you. Gentleman at the back.
Dominic, thank you first for a very thought-provoking talk. You were mentioning the paradox of plenty and the idea that increased resources could, from a biological perspective, lead to an expansion of the intrinsic population of that area and therefore more competition and more war. I guess I'd just like your comments on a kind of alternative idea to that, and that is that rival groups or states or tribes could derive some benefit from sowing conflict and instability within groups that are possessive of very rich natural resources. Do you think that's a viable option in terms of kind of international game theory?
Okay, so yeah, I mean, in the literature on civil war, which probably you know, there is this empirical evidence that there is a lot of profit to be gained from pursuing the war, and especially in states where there are lootable resources, and armed state groups can control resources and gain a lot of profit from controlling their use and selling them. They don't want war to end. And there's lots of examples of this. So that seems pretty compelling to me. Do you agree?
Well, I think there are very interesting examples of this, but you could be quite cynical in your approach. So I think the Middle East actually provides an interesting example of this within a small geographical area relatively. So certain nations in the Middle East have maintained high levels of instability despite being very resource rich. Other states within the Middle East, such as Saudi Arabia, have maintained high levels of stability through very high militarization, despite also having high levels of resources. So I think it could be a trade-off between the levels of protection available to states and their resource intensity.
No, that's interesting. The variation is fascinating. As well as militarization, you've also got this business of groups as well, right? So in Saudi Arabia, you have a relatively homogeneous population compared to, say, Iraq, where you have three very different ethnic groups. So one could argue it's a classic case of the ecological mismatch, that you've got resources surrounded by a territory which doesn't contain the right kind of alignment of groups and resources, perhaps, part of the explanation.
I had two hands over here. Was there a hand that I forgot at the beginning? No. So the gentleman here, gentleman there, and yes, David will end with you. One behind you, there, Caroline, yeah. No, yes, green shirts.
Thank you. Tony Bovey, I'm not an academic. I was interested in your game theory approach with dove and hawk and hawk and hawk. I'm thinking that a lot of that depends on the game assumptions, where it's a zero-sum game or a non-zero-sum game. And I was thinking of the analogy of the prisoner's dilemma with the hawk-hawk, and kill or not being killed, that you could make a reductionist logical argument that, well, why don't they cooperate?
Right. Yeah, so you can conceive of the dove option as cooperation, because in the game, as Maynard Smith set it up, they just split the resource. A lot of people say that's the problem with why would they split the resource? Surely no one should get it. So that you can reconceptualize the game. You're right that if you change, a lot of the conditions, then different things happen. But that chart was supposed to sort of lay out a lot of the different conditions they considered. And while the outcomes were different, the kind of key finding was that hawk never goes away. And one reason is that if everyone becomes a dove, then it's extremely beneficial to be a hawk. So there's a kind of frequency dependence to it. And this is why they refer to evolutionary stable strategies, because playing dove is not a stable strategy.
Well, the question is if the hawk can succeed if everybody else aligns together as a dove, but that gets into contemporary politics far too much. Gentleman with the, yes, checkered shirt, please.
International security, I guess, Mary. You talked about groups being misaligned with their resources in modernity. I just wondered if you can unpack that a bit more.
Okay. So, I mean, the simplest example that lots of people always give is political boundaries in Africa that were set by European empires and cut across ethnic lines. So now you have groups that want to be together, but they belong to two different countries. So that's one example. Another would be resources which lie on the borders between two countries, so they fight over who owns it. So that'd be the kinds of thing I was thinking about. I think it's actually pretty common. And of course, it's always changing as well. So as populations decline or increase, those resources can go into alignment or out of alignment as well. Does it make sense to you?
Yeah, I was just struggling to unpack sort of how far back it goes in terms
Oh, I see.
of whether it's related to the way the tribe used to live on the land they direct control.
I see.
And whether it's that difference of
Yeah.
modernity or whether it's something in the sort of more recent
Yeah, okay.
history.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm conceiving of it as, the last couple of 100 years of the expansion of the empires in particular. But there are other kinds of examples. So you may have heard of the Bali water temple system. So the indigenous people of Bali had this beautiful system of irrigating their land, very hilly areas, and they had to control the water so that the water would get to all of the different fields. And apparently it worked fantastically well. The Dutch came in and kind of reorganized it, said, no, this is a bad way to manage things. Here's a kind of European structure. And it totally failed. So there are often cases where there were kind of natural indigenous methods of successfully managing common pool resources, which were kind of taken away with modern methods. And that's another example of kind of misaligning resource access and the groups that need them.
David, the last question, an ecological curveball for Dominic.
Not at all. David MacDonald from the Wildlife Conservation Research Unit. Dom, as you very kindly said, you and I have worshipped at the same altar, so you won't be surprised to know, I think there was enormous insight in your talk. I wonder, and I'd like your comment on this, is more of a thought than a question, whether a very fruitful area in this context for further thought is what nowadays actually defines a human group, a social group, and therefore how we should apply these ideas to it. And why I say that briefly is that you and I know, others in the audience may not, that we've done not badly in trying to understand vertebrate societies in terms of territoriality and group size for groups of people in essentially tribal-sized societies. And we've done that in terms of looking at territory size relative to group size and thinking about dispersion of resources. Many of the questions you were talking about today are about people living in very, very much larger societies, and the meaning of society in that context seems to me a very interesting area where some territories, of course, and you mentioned them, might have been cookie cut from colonialism in many parts of Africa. Others I can thinking of, from my part of the world, ancient map of clan territories in Scotland give you a rather nice relationship between primary productivity of the ecosystem and size of clan territory. So what is it about modern, large-scale societies that one can interpret in ecological terms?
Okay, so I mean, Two very quick thoughts, because this is a hugely important point. One is that you could argue globalization has created one group, and in many ways it has. If you look at the right commodity or the right domain of interdependence or trade, it is one society. But of course, it's not sovereign at that level. The second thought is, I think scale is hugely important, and it's one reason why this mismatch concept is so important, right? We evolved all of our adaptations for social interaction and exchange in groups of, 25 to 50 people, perhaps. So how do you then function in a big city? Well, we're intelligent human beings, and we can figure it out. But there are many problems where that goes wrong. One thing that strikes me as very interesting is that you may have heard of Dunbar's number, right? This is around 150, which it seems to be, if you plot out cranial capacity and group size among primates, this is the number that seems to be about right for humans to interact with and not only know those people, but remember their interactions with them. It turns out to be this sort of number you'd find in people's address book and so on. It's interesting that there are about 190 countries in the world. So one wonders whether at the massive scale where everything seems to collapse, you've actually recreated a manageable community of 200 or so identities, which we can deal with. And I don't think anyone's thought about what the implications of that are, but it seems to make some aspects of international relations nicely tractable for the human brain.
Dominic, that tempts me as a final point to ask you. Perhaps I was just thinking, well, that's roughly, as you say, the membership of the United Nations General Assembly. Now, if you're inside that, you may question the notion that it's a manageable community. But let me throw you one last question, because, in a few weeks' time, as you're aware, I will be sitting next to a Secretary General who every day is going to be thinking about that kind of ecology that you laid out. Where I still struggle at the end is, what does the Secretary General of the United Nations in the year 2017, who has made prevention the central theme, or let's say overriding purpose of the United Nations in moving forward, relatable to what you presented here this afternoon? Or what would you say is the lesson that he takes? Because one is the analytical and certainly fascinating diagram when you say no wars have happened between two democracies. That's amazing, never thought of it that way. But now moving forward, what do you do if you are a mediator, a facilitator in that community of 193 nations, and you are actually trying to, in a sense, almost act against the deterministic outcome of such a model?
Yeah. Well, it's an extremely difficult question.
Maybe only point in the direction. I don't want to take us too long because I know time has run out, but maybe at least a thought on where is thinking going?
Well, I think if I had 30 seconds, I would say something along the lines of we have to take territorial disputes seriously, because for reasons which we can understand, they are particularly emotional for human beings. And without resolving those disputes, you can't get any further with conflict resolution. So, for example, in Israel and the Palestinian territories, I think many people have come to the same conclusion starting from completely different disciplinary origins, that you've got to sort out the issue of space and land, and only then can other things be resolved. How you do that, I don't know.
The next lecture, live to the General Assembly. Dominic, thank you very much for both sharing your insights today. Yes, a round of applause.